if you had understood all the stuff that had gone before and the kinds of explanations of transcendental argumentation and the place of that kind of argumentation or program in the history of epistemology and that sort of thing, if you knew all those qualifications and the characteristics that make it unique when it comes to presuppositional argumentation that we talked about this morning, then I dare say you could have read the following 9 or 10 pages in Van Til's writings, and that would have been enough right there. I mean, in a sense, if you want to boil Van Til down just to the bare bones of the apologetic argument, the structure itself, here it is. The Survey of Christian Epistemology, I begin on page 201. In this respect, the process of knowledge is a growth into the truth. For this reason, we have spoken of the Christian theistic method as the method of implication into the truth of God. It is reasoning in a spiral fashion rather than in a linear fashion. Accordingly, we have said that we can use the old terms deduction and induction if only we remember that they must be thought of as elements in this one process of implication into the truth of God. Think of it as spiraling down, implicating yourself deeper and deeper into the truth of God using deductive and inductive reasoning as you go. If we begin the course of spiral reasoning at any point in the finite universe, as we must because that is the proximate starting point of all reasoning, we can call the method of implication into the truth of God a transcendental method. That is, we must seek to determine what presuppositions are necessary to any object of knowledge in order that it may be intelligible to us. That sentence is a crucial one. You want to get that. We must seek to determine, this is transcendental method, we must seek to determine what presuppositions are necessary to any object of knowledge in order that it may be intelligible to us. It is not as though we already know some facts and laws to begin with, irrespective of the existence of God, in order then to reason from such a beginning to further conclusions. It is certainly true that if God has any significance for any object of knowledge at all, the relation of God to that object of knowledge must be taken into consideration from the outset. It is this fact that the transcendental method seeks to recognize. So the transcendental method is trying to exhibit something, and that is, if what you're talking about is significant, you must immediately have God as part of your worldview, or you must immediately acknowledge, incorporate the Christian worldview. It does not reason deductively and inductively from outside the Christian worldview to the Christian worldview. It rather says all of your deductive and inductive reasoning already presupposes the Christian worldview if you claim that it has validity, meaning, or significance. The charges made against this type of reasoning we must turn upon those who made them. It will be said of this type of reasoning that it introduces the subjective element of belief in God, which all men do not share. Of this, we can only say that all men should share that belief, and before the fall of man into sin, man did have that belief. Belief in God is the most human attitude conceivable. It is abnormal not to believe in God. We must therefore hold that only the Christian theist has real objectivity, while the others are introducing false prejudices or subjectivity. This is nuclear strength, this paragraph. Van Til says, in order for your argument to have significance, you must incorporate belief in God. The comeback is, oh, well then you're saying that coherence, logical validity, the significance of arguments depends upon a subjective element, whether you believe in God or not. Van Til says, I must turn this criticism back on the person making the criticism. He says, you're the one who's introducing subjectivity. Sound familiar? He said, all these other methods of argument reduced to subjectivity and skepticism. He says, because of the way you approach matters, you're the one who makes everybody subjective. I'm the only one that is introducing objectivity because it's the God's eye point of view that can make sense out of, give intelligibility to the way that you're reasoning. The charge is made that we engage in circular reasoning. Now, if it be called circular reasoning, when we hold it necessary to presuppose the existence of God, we are not ashamed of it because we are firmly convinced that all forms of reasoning that leave God out of account will end in ruin. Okay, so the criticism is made, you're engaged in circular reasoning. Van Til says there's two ways you can respond to that. One, if you remember that anybody who doesn't reason the way we are ends in ruin, then I don't care what you call it. Call it circular reasoning, big deal. The point is my circular reasoning saves intelligibility, and your whatever you want to call it reasoning, deductive, inductive, linear reasoning, destroys the intelligibility of thinking. Yet, we hold that our reasoning cannot fairly be called circular reasoning because we are not reasoning about and seeking to explain facts by assuming the existence and meaning of certain other facts on the same level of being with the facts we are investigating, and then explaining these facts in turn by the facts with which we began. We are presupposing God, not merely another fact of the universe. Let me paraphrase. Van Til says, if we're arguing about some creaturely element of thought or experience, and we tried to introduce something else on the same level, and the two were paying each other's debts in the argument, yeah, then we'd be reasoning in a circle. He says, we're not reasoning about another fact of the universe. We're not, to put it in his terminology, we're not reasoning about something that's within the framework of our presuppositions. Within the framework, you can't reason in a circle. Somebody wants to say, I believe that the price of eggs is $1.59. And then his argument includes as a premise, the price of eggs is $1.59. Van Til would say, yeah, well, that's circular reasoning. That's fallacious. But we're not arguing about another fact of the universe. We're arguing about God. We're not arguing on the same level with the facts of the universe. We're arguing about something which is the framework. I don't mean that in a pantheistic sense. I mean that epistemologically. God is the framework that makes intelligible all the other reasoning that you engage in. And about that kind of thing, all you can do is reason in a circle. Randy earlier brought up the illustration. I remind you again, when people argue about logic, they've got to assume logic while they argue about it. So, circular reasoning, no. Spiral reasoning, because we are assuming something on a different level. Now we'll call this the transcendental level. Different level from that which we deal with when we talk about the facts of history or, science or anything else that human beings reason about. God has a special status. God is the transcendental. God's not just one more object among many. I assure you that when in secular universities, professors, philosophy professors, talk about proving God's existence, they always take for granted. They don't flag it. They don't let you know they're doing this. They may not even think about how they're doing it because they take it for granted. They always assume that proving God is like proving any other fact of the universe. You've got to use the same kind of logic, the same kind of empirical premises, and so forth, and then we hope that we can get a generalization. If you're religious, you hope that you can get a generalization big enough or extensive enough to finally get to the supernatural. Of course, you never can. Yes, that's right. Refuses to begin with the creator-creature distinction. God is not like another fact of the universe. Somebody says, oh, well, how so? God exists, we exist, so he's just like anything else that exists. We say, no, God exists in such a way that nothing else could exist without him. That gives him kind of, it's not just a special prerogative. It's like, well, we give special favors to God like we do to our grandfather. We don't make our grandfather carry his weight when we're bringing groceries in from the store because, we know that he's old and decrepit or something. We're not saying we want to grant God special favors. We're saying God has special prerogatives. Everything depends upon God, and therefore we don't reason about God in the same way that we reason about the other facts of the universe. Now, go to page 204. Let me back up and get a running start into what I wanted to read from page 203. At the very bottom of the page, if God is to be thought of at all as necessary for man's interpretation of the facts or objects of knowledge, he must be thought of as being determinative of the objects of knowledge. In other words, he must then be thought of as the only ultimate interpreter, and man must be thought of as a finite reinterpreter. If God in his existence is significant for the objects of knowledge, it must be because he's determined the objects of knowledge. If he determines the objects of knowledge, then he's the ultimate interpreter, and we're thinking his thoughts after him when we know things. We're reinterpreting. Since then, the absolute self-consciousness of God is the final interpreter of all facts, man's knowledge is analogical of God's knowledge. Since all the finite facts exist by virtue of the interpretation of God, man's interpretation of the finite facts is ultimately dependent upon God's interpretation of the facts. Man cannot, except to his own hurt, look at the facts without looking at God's interpretation of the facts. Man's knowledge of the facts is then a reinterpretation of God's interpretation. It is this that is meant by saying that man's knowledge is analogical of God's knowledge. We must now consider more fully the question how one who has thus become convinced that analogical reasoning is the only type of reasoning that gives us truth at all must face one who is convinced that univocal reasoning, where the creator-creature distinction is not taken into account, is the only type of reasoning that can possibly bring one into contact with the truth. I'm going to jump down now to the last sentence in the middle paragraph. We can start with any fact at all and challenge our friends the enemy to give us an intelligible interpretation of it. Start with any fact and say, just give me an interpretation that's intelligible, that gives me a broader context and then a context beyond that one where everything fits. So it's all coherent, so it makes sense. Now what happens, you see, is that when you push out far enough, the unbeliever says, well, everything that happens is random. I say, oh, it is? Well, then if it's random, then you couldn't be very sure about these mechanical principles of fixing carburetors that you were using when you talked about this car. Because in a random universe, there are no mechanical principles you can count on. But you don't get there immediately. You've got to say, give me an interpretation. Now, make that intelligible. Put that into a broader context. Since the non-theist is so heartily convinced that univocal reasoning is the only possible kind of reasoning, we must ask him to reason univocally for us in order that we may see the consequences. Underline that. See the consequences. Van Til is going to argue, for argument's sake, assume what you're saying is true. What are the consequences of it? And if those consequences are absurdity or the impossibility of the very thing you started with, then you've refuted yourself. Oh, univocal. Okay. Univocal means to speak with one voice or to have everything have the same basic kind of meaning, univocal definition of terms. No, univocal, Van Til is using it kind of in a metaphorical way to indicate that God and man, when we talk about God reasoning and man reasoning, we're speaking univocally. They reason the same way, they're on the same level, there's no difference between them as they approach the facts and try to figure out the universe.
You said a while ago.
That's right. God and man on the same level, so there's no creator-creature distinction. Analogical reasoning says God first interprets things, so my thinking is not original, and it's not thinking that God does. I'm not God. I have to think his thoughts after him. So that's analogical. The unbeliever, wanting to have autonomy, says, no, God and man approach everything in the same way. God may be bigger, he may be stronger, but in terms of epistemology, God knows in the same way that man knows. He approaches information and tries to interpret it. So we invite the autonomous man to reason, to interpret something, and then try to show him the consequences of it. In other words, we believe it to be in harmony with and a part of the process of reasoning analogically with the non-theist, that we ask him to show us first what he can do. We may, to be sure, offer to him at once a positive statement of our position, but this he will at once reject as quite out of the question. So we may ask him to give us something better. You love it when Van Til starts playing, like he's just very simple and coy. He goes, well, here's my position, here's how I understand the facts and everything. The other says, oh, we can't accept that. And he goes, oh, okay. Well, then give me something better, please. The reason he gives for rejecting our position is, in the last analysis, that it involves self-contradiction. We see again, as an illustration of this charge, the rejection of the theistic conception of God, conception that God is absolute, and that he has nevertheless created this world for his glory. This, the non-theist says, is self-contradictory. And it no doubt is, from a non-theistic point of view. How can God be all glorious and then create the world to bring him glory? He already has all the glory, so how can he create the world to do that? But the final question is not whether a statement appears to be contradictory. The final question, everybody ready for the bell to ring? The final question is in which framework or on which view of reality, the Christian or the non-Christian, the law of contradiction can have application to any fact. Here we're arguing about logic, the law of non-contradiction. Van Til says in the end, it's not important what appears contradictory to you or to me. Ultimately, the question is, within which framework can logic have any meaning at all? The non-Christian rejects the Christian view out of hand as being contradictory. Then when he is asked to furnish a foundation for the law of contradiction, he can offer nothing but the idea of contingency. Those of you who have heard my argument with Gordon Stein, see where I got my stuff, right? When Stein now has to give a foundation for logic, all he has left is contingency, because that's his worldview. But guess what? If it's a contingent universe, there are no necessary laws of thinking. What we shall have to do then is try to reduce our opponent's position to an absurdity. Nothing less will do. Without God, man is completely lost in every respect, epistemologically as well as morally and religiously. Van Til's, this is something that really grabbed hold of me a number of years ago, as I realized Van Til, when he talks about salvation, he's not just talking about going to heaven. He's saying you can't save morality, life in this world. You can't save your thinking, the intelligibility of your thinking, if you're not a Christian. But exactly what do we mean by reducing our opponent's position to an absurdity? He thinks he has already reduced our position to an absurdity by the simple expedient just spoken of. But we must point out to him that upon a theistic basis, our position is not reduced to an absurdity by indicating the logical difficulties involved in the conception of creation. Upon the theistic basis, it must be contended that the human categories are but analogical of God's categories, so that it is to be expected the human thought will not be able to comprehend how God shall be absolute and at the same time create the universe for his glory. If taken on the same level of existence, it is no doubt a self-contradiction to say that a thing is full and at the same time is being filled. But it is exactly this point that is in question, whether God is to be thought of as on the same level with man. What the anti-theist should have done is to show that even upon a theistic basis, our conception of creation involves self-contradiction. Van Til says, if you want to do damage to my position, come stand within my worldview and show that it's incoherent. I welcome you. And that would be a worthwhile intellectual, project for an unbeliever. But for you to stand in your worldview and say our theological premises are inconsistent, why should I be concerned about that? Of course they're inconsistent in your worldview.
Paraphrase may take on the same level of existence, no doubt self-contradiction.
On the same level. We're not dealing with God as just any other truth or premise or reality that we know in our natural experience. God is a supernatural being, and God's significance in epistemology is that he has transcendental importance, not just, of all the things that I know on the creaturely level, some are more important than others, okay? From a personal standpoint, I'd say knowing my children is more important than knowing Oral Hershiser, okay? So they're all on the same level as human beings. Some are more important to me than others. And of all the things that I know, some are more epistemologically important. Okay? It's probably a good thing for me to know, generally, how, how can I do this? What example do I want to use? It's more significant for me to know something about combustion engines than it is for me to know, for instance, that my car is out of gas at this particular moment. More important than the knowledge of combustion engines is more general and systematic, and therefore has more application and implication than does the simple fact that my car right now is out of gas. So we have, on the level of our natural experience, things that we know. Some are more important than others, but they're all on the same level. How important is the knowledge of God? It's more important than combustion engines and more important than my children, as important as those things are, because God's existence, or the truth of the statement that God exists, has implications for everything that I know. So when I argue about God, I'm not arguing on the same level as just anything else that I might know. It's not just one more object. It's not like, well, every proposition that's true has the same value. Well, as truth, abstractly put, yeah, they're all called truth, so they all have the same value. But there's more to propositions than just their truth value. Likewise, the proposition about God's existence is not even in the same category as those truths about our natural experience, because that truth is a transcendental. In terms of which everything else makes sense. So at different levels, that's a paraphrase. Actually, his is a paraphrase of my technical explanation, but that's what he's getting at.
He's not using that sentence to explain why it can be that God is full of glory and yet created the earth for self-glory. Am I reading that wrong? I thought he was using that.
He says, if you think that God is like any other natural object, and the way we know God is the way we know everything else in the world, then it will seem like a contradiction to say that he's full of glory, yet he's being filled with glory. But if God is not like every other object, within Christian theology, we can believe that God manifests the fullness of his glory by bringing greater glory to himself through saving people, creating the world, showing the wonder of the stars, and so forth.
Dr. Mark?
Yes, sir?
Well, be fair to say that an example of contingency would be from your debate with Stein, where he denied the immaterial realm while holding the laws of logic. Then when you asked him what the laws of logic were, he ended up saying that they were abstract or immaterial.
Yeah, well, he wanted them...
contradicting himself.
Stein was so bad in that debate that he didn't even stick to one position when he was arguing with me. And so that's always, the danger is you get somebody who's slippery and he doesn't even know that he's slipping back and forth. At one point, Stein said that the laws of logic are conventional. Yeah, which would mean contingent, depending on the culture in which you live. At another point, he talked about the laws of logic having necessity. And so, it's kind of, sometimes you got to get the guy to stand still so you can shoot him. It's like, which position do you want to hold here? I'll be glad to shoot you at any point, but stand still. Okay, page 205 in the middle. We must therefore give our opponents better treatment than they give us. We must point out to them that univocal reasoning, autonomous reasoning, itself leads to self-contradiction, not only from a theistic point of view, but from a non-theistic point of view as well. This is crucial. Van Til says, the unbeliever sees contradictions in Christian theology. We say, well, yeah, within your framework of thought, they are contradictory. They appear so. But they're not contradictory within our worldview. He says, but now we must do better to the unbeliever than he's done to us. We don't want to simply say, your view of reality, say your view of evolution is contradictory because we know God created everything in a mature way according to the Bible. So that's contradictory. He says, we got to do better than that. We want to show that their point of view is contradictory even on their understanding of logic. Take your own worldview, and Van Til says you destroy yourself. What did David Hume say yesterday in that quotation? Oh, I took it upstairs. That if we make reason abstract, it provides the grounds for what? Do you have it there, Scott? Can you give it to me exactly?
If reason is considered an abstract view, it furnishes invincible arguments against
against itself. So we take what you understand as logic and show that you're being self-contradictory on your own terms. He was specifically thinking of reason in the empiricist way, but the point generally taken is what you take to be reason destroys itself. It is this that we ought to mean when we say that we must meet our enemy on their own ground. It is this that we ought to mean when we say that we reason from the impossibility of the contrary. The contrary is impossible only if it is self-contradictory when operating on the basis of its own assumptions. It is this, too, that we should mean when we say that we are arguing ad hominem. We do not really argue ad hominem unless we show that someone's position involves self-contradiction, and there is no self-contradiction unless one's reasoning is shown to be directly contradictory of or to lead to conclusions which are contradictory of one's own assumptions. That's 205. To argue ad hominem here, I don't think he should have put it this way, but basically he's arguing against the man by saying, I'll grant whatever you want, and then I'll argue against what we've already granted based on what you've given me.
He picks that up like Kant, by the way. Like Kant called that text argument ad hominem as well.
Oh, okay, that's good. Good. Kant apparently used that kind of terminology. In terms of the way logic is taught today, that's not usually the understanding of an ad hominem argument. But you can see how that's against the man. You accept what the man says, and then you turn it against him. On page 206, the sentence at the end of the paragraph spanning the page. Similarly, if we reason when we place ourselves upon our opponent's position, we cannot for a moment do more than argue thus for argument's sake. Van Til says, I'm going to meet this man on his own turf for argument's sake. Okay? Sometimes people have asked me, Dr. Bahnsen, why did you bother to go study philosophy at a secular university? Why did you get your PhD with people who don't share your Christian worldview? Well, I mean, there are other kinds of answers. I mean, I think I learned a lot about philosophy in a technical sense and so forth and so on. But you see, if I'm going to do apologetics, though these philosophers didn't help me learn about Christianity and how to defend it, they taught me a lot about how unbelievers reason. So I'm now able to meet them. I mean, I hope I can meet them on their own turf and play their game better than they play it. Okay? So when I take a course from John Hospers, who is in ethical theory what's known as a rule egoist, that is, we should follow those rules that are in our personal benefit. That's his ethical theory. I can, without having to go to the Bible and say, shame on you, Dr. Hospers, you're disagreeing with what Jesus said, I can take what Hospers taught me and write a paper showing that rule egoism destroys itself. So that's why you learn something about the way unbelievers reason. Now, you don't all have to go and get a PhD in philosophy. That's not the point of the illustration. I'm trying to illustrate what Van Til means, that we place ourselves on our opponent's position for argument's sake. When we reason thus, we are not reasoning on the basis of some abstract law of self-contradiction. We've seen that the very question between the theist and the anti-theist is as to the foundation of the law of contradiction. When they criticize our position and think they've reduced it to the place where it falls under the law of self-contradiction, we do not give in to defeat or appeal to irrationality in the name of faith. But we challenge their interpretation of the law of contradiction. We hold that they have falsely assumed that the self-contradictory is to be identified with that which is beyond the comprehension of man. But this takes for granted that human categories are ultimate categories, which is just the thing in question. The unbeliever assumes his categories must be the ultimate ones. We say, well, that's what you're supposed to be proving. And then it's about 3/4 down the page, 206. Yet in order to bring this argument as closely to the non-regenerate consciousness as we may, we must seek to show that the non-theist is self-contradictory upon his own assumptions as well as upon the assumption of the truth of theism, and that he cannot even be self-contradictory upon a non-theistic basis, since if he saw himself to be self-contradictory, he would be self-contradictory no longer. Now, when this method of reasoning from the impossibility of the contrary is carried out, there is really nothing more to do. I mean, he has more to say, but you get the point? Essentially, I'm saying to the unbeliever, you want to argue with me? Want to come onto the basketball court and play the reason-giving game? Great. Then let's look at your worldview, look at my worldview. On your worldview, even given your assumptions, you can't give reason. You're defeated on your own terms. By the way, you're also defeated from the authoritative standpoint that I might have as a Christian, saying God says that you're wrong. But you too have to say that you're wrong, given your own assumptions. But if you stand in my worldview, I can save rationality, science, whatever you've been arguing. And Vancil says, once we've done that, there's really nothing else to do. I mean, when somebody brings up a particular objection, there's research you might want to do about that to help them, feel more comfortable about the truth of Christianity. But from an apologetical standpoint, what he's essentially done is taken the weapon away from the unbeliever, saying, you want to argue with us? You haven't got any weapons. Because your method of arguing undermines arguing. And so you can't play this game.
Like what he says about complete self-contradiction is possible only in hell.
Well, even there it's not. It would be hell if it was complete. But in hell, men will still be made in the image of God. Okay, so that's my first short reading in this filet mignon, back to the basics of transcendental presuppositional apologetics. The other one comes from the defense of the faith. Somebody who has the formula can figure out the pages. That'd be wonderful. I'm going to be on pages 116 to 120, and then page 135. For pages 116 to 120, subtract 17, according to our formula.
Yeah, 199. Okay. Yeah, 99.
So if I'm on 116, you're on 99? Okay. Reasoning by presupposition. Did it work? Oh, I love it when a thing comes together like this. These things being as they are, it will be our first task in this chapter to show that a consistently Christian method of apologetic argument, in agreement with its own basic conception of the starting point, must be by presupposition. To argue by presupposition is to indicate what are the epistemological and metaphysical principles that underlie and control one's method. That's a very important sentence. To reason by presupposition, you've got to lay out your metaphysic and epistemology, and you've got to make sure the unbeliever understands his metaphysic and epistemology. The Reformed apologist will frankly admit that his own methodology presupposes the truth of Christian theism. Basic to all the doctrines of Christian theism is that of the self-contained God, or if we wish, that of the ontological Trinity. It is this notion of the ontological Trinity that ultimately controls a truly Christian methodology. Our metaphysical view controls our method, our epistemology. Based upon this notion of the ontological Trinity and consistent with it is the concept of the counsel of God, according to which all things in the created world are regulated. So we begin with God, the triune, God who is self-sufficient, God the creator, God the sovereign controller of all things. Christian methodology is therefore based upon presuppositions that are quite the opposite of those of the non-Christian. It is claimed to be of the very essence of any non-Christian form of methodology that it cannot be determined in advance to what conclusions it must lead. It's neutral. We just go out there and let the facts speak for themselves, right? To assert, as the Christian apologist is bound to do, if he is not to deny the very thing he is seeking to establish, that the conclusion of a true method is the truth of Christian theism, is, from the point of view of the non-Christian, the clearest evidence of authoritarianism. In spite of this claim to neutrality on the part of the non-Christian, the Reformed apologist must point out that every method, the supposedly neutral one, no less than any other, presupposes either the truth or falsity of Christian theism. You might want to make a mental note, or in your actual written notes here. Van Til is offering now a bivalent structure for argument. He says every method assumes the truth of Christian theism or that it's not true. Ultimately, there's only two. Why am I pointing this out? I might as well cash in on it now. Because people are always going to say, well, Van Til, you've only refuted worldviews 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. What about worldviews 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? Van Til's point is there's only two worldviews. Or to put it better, every worldview either assumes the truth of Christianity or assumes that it's not true. The objection immediately is, no, it doesn't. There are some that are neutral, that are non-committal. Now, who's right, who's wrong here? Van Til is going to quote Jesus, right? He who is not with me is against me. That's the interesting thing about this worldview. You don't get to sit on the fence about it. You either affirm it or you deny it. Now, you may be polite in your denying it. You might even say, I'm glad to talk about this. It might possibly be true. But to say it might possibly be true is, from Van Til's standpoint, to say it's not actually true, and so you're denying it. Given this, now, if he's wrong about this, you might have to do some reconstruction of the presuppositional approach. But you have to understand, Van Til doesn't believe we've got a zillion worldviews out there. Let's get busy, because by the time we die, we've got to refute each one of them. It's not an inductive process of knocking down this one, then this one, this one. Van Til says all of them either assume Christianity is true or it's not. Now, if they assume that it's true, we're done, obviously. But the point is, the reason we're arguing is because they assume Christianity is not true. So they're in that worldview that denies Christianity. Yes. Yeah, this is Van Til's law of excluded middle. On worldviews, it's either Christian or it's not Christian. Somebody says, yeah, but look at all the differences between existentialists and rationalists, and nihilists, and on and on and on. All these different worldviews that are out there. Van Til says, they're all brothers under the skin. For our purposes, they really all have the same worldview, and then they argue over details. Now, that makes sense. By analogy, there are a lot of Christians, right? We're all brothers under the skin, spiritually speaking, but then we differ on details. Some of us believe in infant baptism, some of us don't. And that isn't to say it's relative and the Bible's not clear on it, but we're all Christians in terms of our worldview. And so there are non-Christians who disagree with each other on details, but the point is, you're either Christian or you're not Christian when it comes to your worldview. Every method, even the supposedly neutral one, presupposes either the truth or the falsity of Christian theism. He excludes any middle ground. The method of reasoning by presupposition may be said to be indirect rather than direct. There's only two values, Christianity or not Christianity. Now, I'm going to use an indirect method. I'm going to refute non-Christianity. If you know anything about logic, okay, it's like a disjunctive syllogism, A or B, not B, therefore A. The method of reasoning by presupposition may be said to be indirect rather than direct. The issue between believers and non-believers in Christian theism cannot be settled by a direct appeal to facts or laws whose nature and significance is already agreed upon by both parties to the debate. And here is the crucial sentence. The question is rather as to what is the final reference point required to make the facts and laws intelligible. We can't directly go to the facts and say, that proves Christianity. And nor can the unbeliever go directly to the facts and say, that disproves Christianity. Van Til says the question is rather, whose reference point can make the facts or the laws intelligible? The question is as to what the facts and laws really are. Are they what the non-Christian methodology assumes that they are? He doesn't mean here what are the specific facts of history, but what is a fact? What's the nature of a fact? Is it a random event in a chance universe? Are they what the non-Christian methodology assumes that they are? Are they what the Christian theistic methodology presupposes they are? When people say, let's just go to the facts to settle this, we have to say, well, but what do you think a fact is? What do I think a fact is? If you think a fact is just some kind of random event in a chance universe, then we can't go to the facts to settle anything. Facts don't settle anything because they're random. It's a chance universe. So when you say, let's go to the facts to settle something, you must be thinking of facts as a Christian thinks of facts in order that you can use them to argue against the Christian view. It's not just they have no stability, they have no... Yeah, he's assuming they have a stability, but he's assuming that they have identifiability as well, that they're individuated from one another. The answer to this question cannot be finally settled by any direct discussion of facts. It must, in the last analysis, be settled indirectly. The Christian apologist must place himself upon the position of his opponent, assuming the correctness of his method merely for argument's sake, in order to show him that on such a position the facts are not facts and the laws are not laws. Okay, so I say, okay, you got your worldview. Let me reason with you in terms of your worldview. I'm going to stand within your framework of thought. And guess what? Within that framework of thought, there are no laws, there are no facts. Why are there no laws? Just so we don't run over this too quickly. Well, in a chance universe, there can't be any necessity to anything. In a chance universe, things can change. So there's no invariance. In a chance universe, there couldn't be anything necessary and invariant, so there couldn't be anything law-like. How come there are no facts? In a chance universe, you can't individuate one thing from another. Everything's sound and fury signifying nothing. Everything's random, everything's the same, and everything is different. Everything's so different that you never can say there's a similarity between two things. You couldn't even identify that as a barn over there because that assumes there's some continuing idea of barrenness. But in a chance universe, there's just experience, 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 and you can't give any kind of unity to it. So there are no facts and there are no laws.
In reality, talking about in a chance universe, there really wouldn't even be experience, experience, experience.
That's right.
Because there's not the experience, experience.
In a chance universe, when I say there's experience, 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 what have I done? Minimally, I've said there's 1, 2, 3 things. That's right. I've individuated them. In a chance universe, for all I know, there's not 3 experiences. There's just 1 experience. And it has what we call 3 as components. But you can't call them components because that assumes there's an order in terms of which you can see a structure. When you get hold of this, excuse me just a second, when you get hold of this argument, you see how powerful it is? Van Til is able to destroy, I mean, out of kindness, we don't act mean or harsh to people, but we can utterly destroy the unbeliever. Take his worldview and just say, on your worldview, you couldn't argue at all.
Yeah, that's what's over and over again. This paragraph right here in the middle of 100, where he says the reference point, without that, you can't make intelligible any facts. Well, Sartre he's famous for saying, without the finite reference point, or the infinite reference point, all the finite points are absurd. They don't have any. So he's recognizing that and then making the wrong conclusion about that. But he's trying to be consistent with that.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Sartre's good that way. He admits all these other schools of philosophy are a bunch of lawyers, basically. They're just, they're paid to try to come up with answers. They're trying to defend a guilty client, and no one's going to be able to. Everything's absurd, Sartre says. That's my beginning point. Everything's absurd. Now, what are we going to do since everything's absurd? And I don't believe Sartre can live fully consistently because, in the end, to give you one example, Sartre says, in an absurd universe, no one has authority over you. So no one can tell you how to live your life. You be authentic. You be free. So Sartre says, I order you to take no orders from anybody. Okay, continuing the reading, we must also ask the non-Christian to place himself upon the Christian position for argument's sake, in order that he may be shown that only upon such a basis do facts and laws appear intelligible. Say, now if you stand within the framework of Christian presuppositions, not only do you see that facts and laws are intelligible, but within this framework, it's the only one where they could be intelligible. This, too, is anticipating an argument that many people bring up. They'll say, well, you presuppositionalists have shown a sufficient condition for intelligibility, but you haven't shown that it's necessary. Van Til answers it here. He says, well, within our framework, it's necessary. Somebody says, okay, but maybe your framework's not the right one. Van Til says, fine. What's the alternative? Absurdity. But that's fine. Your choices are between Christianity and absurdity. But don't suggest that within the Christian framework, which makes sense of things, you can continue arguing and then argue there might be another framework that can do it just as well. Within the Christian framework, there's one and only one that can do it. Now, you might make that the basis for rejecting Christianity. So, well, I don't think you've really shown that. I don't think you can show that. Van Til would say, fine. Then where are you standing when you're making this criticism of my worldview? You're either standing in my worldview in another one. I'd like you to tell me about that worldview. Of course, we've already done this dance, right? And it doesn't work. To admit one's own presuppositions and to point out the presuppositions of others is therefore to maintain that all reasoning is in the nature of the case circular reasoning. He means you're reasoning about your ultimate presuppositions. The starting point, the method, and the conclusion are always involved in one another. Let us say that the Christian apologist has placed the position of Christian theism before his opponent. Let us say further that he has pointed out that his own method of investigation of reality presupposes the truth of his position. This will appear to his friend, whom he is seeking to win to an acceptance of the Christian position, as highly authoritarian and out of accord with the proper use of human reason. What will the apologist do next? If he is a Roman Catholic or an Arminian, he will tone down the nature of Christianity to some extent in order to make it appear that the consistent application of his friend's neutral method will lead to an acceptance of Christian theism after all. That is, we don't want to seem authoritarian, so we'll accept what you call a neutral method and try to satisfy you that your neutral, allegedly neutral method, your pretended neutral method will actually lead to Christianity. But if he's a Calvinist, this way is not open to him. He will point out that the more consistently his friend applies his supposedly neutral method, the more certainly he will come to the conclusion that Christian theism is not true. Let me take the argument for the resurrection of Christ just to show you. If I allow the unbeliever to reason in terms of his worldview, which he pretends is neutral, and then I present all these facts to show that Jesus very probably rose from the dead, if he accepts that conclusion within that worldview, he will have to conclude most certainly that Christianity is not true. Why is that? Well, because within his worldview, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's because there's some very odd principles that operate in the biological realm that we haven't discovered yet. On his principles, that's what it would have to be. He cannot accept that Jesus rose from the dead and then say it's a miracle. Given his neutral method, he has to say, well, we're not allowed to bring the supernatural in here. We have to say that's a natural event. This allegedly neutral approach, of course, is not neutral. That's Van Til's point. You let him get away with using his method will destroy your worldview. Even when it appears he's agreeing with points of your worldview, he will in fact have naturalized them and cut them down to size. If you allow him to use his neutral method, where he is the center of authority for what he believes and so forth, will he ever, if he's consistent with that, say, God's the center of authority for what I believe? See, God comes to him and says, I declare what you can believe, what you must believe. It's not up to you. And who are you to talk back to God? Let God be true, though all men are liars. But you can never get to that conclusion if you begin with the idea of a neutral method where man is the ultimate authority over what he believes. So Van Til says, if you allow the unbeliever to continue with his pretended neutrality, you're just going to reinforce his rejection of Christianity. What looks like an acceptance of points of the Christian system is in fact the destruction of those very points that have been received.
I wonder if that's not really true, but they wouldn't do that. But philosophical atheist Kai Nielsen actually said that very thing
Because almost like he took that right from Van Til. J.B. Morton presented him with the class historical arguments for the resurrection, and he said, I grant it's all true. What's that prove? It doesn't prove anything. It just simply proves that something bizarre happened. We don't know the answer yet. I couldn't believe he said it, but he simply turned the whole argument right back on Moreland, and I don't think that no one had a good response to that.
Yeah.
UCLA professor of physics saying the same thing.
Well, yeah, I've been told that, and I don't know his name, and I can't give you the context, and so I feel a little uneasy now using that illustration. When someone said, what are the details? I said, well, I've been told that this guy, this physics professor, once said in class, he said, well, sure, you can say that historically Jesus rose from the dead. Now we're looking for an explanation of it.
Is that why it's immoral to use a strictly evidential approach?
I think it's immoral to encourage people to sin. I think the evidential approach, in its neutralist understanding, encourages people to try to be the ultimate authority. I believe that's sinful, and so indirectly I have to say that that is, in fact, an immoral approach. It's not immoral in the same way that the guy who goes to a prostitute says, I'm just going to now live licentiously. But it's immoral in that it's encouraging people to live contrary to faith in God by saying, first assume faith in yourself so that you might come to faith in God.
Love yourself first.
Yes, if you just love yourself enough, you'll have to end up loving God. If you just respect yourself enough, you'll have to end up respecting God.
Still in the program of loving myself. Really don't come to the next level.
All right, toward the bottom of page 118, Van Til talks about appealing to the knowledge of the true method which the natural man knows but suppresses. Notice he says true method here. He's not just appealing to the knowledge of the true God or the truth about God and creation, but he says the natural man knows what the true method of thinking is, but he suppresses it. He knows that he should give glory to God and submit to his authority, but he suppresses it. The natural man at bottom knows that he is the creature of God. He knows also that he's responsible to God. He knows that he should live to the glory of God. He knows that in all that he does, he should stress that the field of reality which he investigates has the stamp of God's ownership upon it. But he suppresses his knowledge of himself as he truly is. He is the man with the iron mask. A true method of apologetics must seek to tear off that iron mask. Van Til had great illustrations. Here's this guy who's got this iron mask, you know. My job as an apologist is not to flatter the mask and say, you know, I think I can show in terms of the principles of your iron mask that there's really a face behind that iron mask. Van Til says, we need to tear that mask off. Stop pretending to be autonomous. You're not. The Roman Catholic and the Arminian make no attempt to do so. They even flatter the wearer about his fine appearance. Van Til's being very kind here. You know, this is a very strong indictment. Because natural theology, the Roman Catholic approach, and even Arminian evidential apologetics, they'll flatter you know, you're really doing very well when it comes to natural reasoning. You're very good as a historian. You're very good as a scientist. Van Til would say, you couldn't do anything that you're doing if you didn't already depend upon the God that you use your science and history to argue against. Anyway, they flatter his fine appearance. In the introductions of their books on apologetics, Arminian as well as Roman Catholic apologists frequently seek to set their opponents at ease by assuring them that their method in its field is all that any Christian could desire. Don't get nervous. All I want you to do is apply the same method that you apply in that field that you're familiar with. You know, if you're a biologist or an astronomer or a physicist, psychologist, whatever. I'll accept your method. I know you mean very well. You're doing very well. It's very, very fine. I flatter your neutrality. In contradistinction from this, the Reformed apologists will point out again and again that the only method that will lead to the truth in any field is that method which recognizes the fact that man is a creature of God, that he must therefore seek to think God's thoughts after him. It is not as though the Reformed apologist should not interest himself in the nature of the non-Christian's method. On the contrary, he should make a critical analysis of it. He should, as it were, join his friend in the use of it, but he should do so self-consciously with the purpose of showing that its most consistent application not merely leads away from Christian theism, but in leading away from Christian theism leads to the destruction of reason and science as well. It's one of the most important sentences in all of Van Til's writings. At least it was in my learning of the system. Then the coin drops and you say, oh yeah. What I want to show him is that if you're consistent, you can't possibly be a Christian. But if you're consistent, you can't use logic and science either. In leading away from Christianity, you lead away from the intelligibility of everything. An illustration may indicate more clearly what is meant. Suppose we think of a man made of water in an infinitely extended and bottomless ocean of water. Desiring to get out of the water, he makes a ladder of water. He sets his ladder up upon the water and against the water, and then attempts to climb out of the water. So hopeless and senseless a picture must be drawn of the natural man's methodology, based as it is upon the assumption that time or chance is ultimate. One of the easiest illustrations, at least for me, of this man of water is, C.S. Lewis uses this as well. If the unbeliever is right that all we have is matter in motion, so that physics explains everything, then the real question is, I'm nothing more than just matter in motion, just like the rock is matter in motion. How then do I ever, as matter in motion, get to the point where I think of myself as matter in motion? Rocks don't think of themselves. How can self-consciousness be explained as matter in motion? That's devastating. Van Til says, on the unbeliever's position, everything's the same. Everything's water. Everything's chance. Everything has these material characteristics. Well, but then how do you take water and make a ladder that you can put against the water so that the man who is made out of the same stuff, water, can climb on the ladder of water out of the water? How do you rise above matter in motion to now be an intellect who can talk about matter in motion? Because you're nothing but matter in motion. The non-Christian position destroys itself. On his assumption, his own rationality is a product of chance. On his assumption, even the laws of logic which he employs are products of chance. The rationality and purpose that he may be searching for are still bound to be products of chance. So then the Christian apologist, whose position requires him to hold that Christian theism is really true and as such must be taken as the presupposition which alone makes the acquisition of knowledge in any field intelligible, must join his friend in his hopeless gyrations so as to point out to him that his efforts are always in vain. It will then appear that Christian theism, which was first rejected because of its supposed authoritarian character, is the only position which gives human reason a field for successful operation and a method of true progress in knowledge. My math may be off, but I think I've only read for you 8 pages out of 2 books. It's all there, isn't it? I think this is brilliant. It can be improved on. The expression of it might be cleaned up. But you know what? While I'm improving on Van Til's Christian presuppositionalism, I'm still being a Christian presuppositionalist, aren't I? Okay, what questions would you like to ask before I begin to go over the objections that people have raised against Van Til's apologetic? Mark.
Didn't you say you were going to throw away that a child or someone brings?
That's what I'm going to end with today, if all goes well. The last objection is going to be, well, this is all too complicated, it's too philosophical, and I'm going to try to... Now, don't be like that. That wasn't directed at anybody in our class. Lots of people read Van Til, and they have trouble understanding him because he doesn't write all that well. But once they understand it, they say, well, but what good is that? How many Christians can, use Kantian transcendental analysis and so forth? And so what I want to point out is that the same program is executable at a lower level, even by children. And hopefully that's where we'll end up. Okay, other questions about this summary of the transcendental use, the presuppositional use of transcendental analysis?
I like the analogy you used before, where the unbeliever trying to disprove the existence of air is all the while reading it.
Yeah. And it turns out I took that from Van Til. I actually had forgotten that I'd read that, but I run across it in writing this book on him again. A man may argue and sound very intelligent against the existence of air. The strange thing is, all the while he argues against the existence of air, he's breathing while he's doing his talking and arguing. And that picture, I think, is a good picture of the unbeliever and all of what he's doing. He's arguing against the Christian worldview, to be sure. And he may sound very brilliant at points, maybe very clever at points. And yet, in order to argue at all, he has to be assuming the Christian worldview to argue against it. As Paul said, in him we live and move and have our being.
What about the question that was asked the last 2 days about how extensive a Christian worldview? I mean, you have, and the way Rich worded it, you have to be a post-millennialist to present a proper worldview to use a transcendental argument.
Okay, in order to use the transcendental argument most effectively, you must believe in infant baptism. Why is that? Well, as I approach it, because I think the Bible teaches infant baptism, right? So, if the truer we are to the source, to the foundation from which everything else makes sense, then the better will be our defense of the faith. So, I want to say, when somebody says, well, do you have to believe in infant baptism to be a good presuppositionalist? I have to say, well, to be the best presuppositionalist you do, because I believe that's what the Bible teaches. But then I would also say, no, you don't. Because the illustration I used the other day is in football, the guy who scores the touchdown is separate from the other players, isn't he? Not everybody carries the ball, into the end zone. But if we think that there aren't secondary players that he needs for the whole team to operate, then we don't understand how football is played. So the elements of the Christian worldview that are going to be the frontline ball carriers in most arguments are going to be things having to do with the ontological Trinity, God's foreordination, Christ being the incarnation of God, his death on the cross being for the redemption of men, the need of the Holy Spirit's regeneration for thinking, these sorts of elements. But then when I just said regeneration, there are different evangelical doctrines of regeneration. And so the better use of an appeal to regeneration would be one that sees it in its purest biblical light. And the same would be true in terms of covenant, what we do in response to God's covenant. Do we raise our children acknowledging that all things belong to God? So forth and so on. Now, I don't want to make you Baptists feel uncomfortable, but presuppositionalism presses also for a covenant consciousness that demands that everything that we do recognize the authority of God, and that means the way we raise our children. And we recognize the antithesis between those who are God's people and those who are not God's people. So our children are distinguished from the world and are raised to think all their thoughts after God. That isn't because we control their hearts. They may grow up to be rebellious. Sadly, I have a child that has not lived, faithfully and has been excommunicated. That breaks my heart. But I still raise my child as one who is to understand that she belongs to God, she is to think his thoughts after him, and so forth. And that's why she was set apart by God in baptism. We see that infant baptism ties in then with covenant consciousness, which ties in with the sovereignty of God and ties in with this Christian worldview that's defended, in that way. Please don't feel bad if you don't agree with infant baptism. I'm just trying to illustrate that though I don't argue infant baptism with the unbeliever, back there a ways, that's still part of my team. I didn't score this touchdown without that, implicitly being part of the system. Now, we may all get together on the team and say, now, do we want this person to be the guard or not? And we may think we can improve on our effort. We've scored a lot of touchdowns as a football team, but maybe we ought to get rid of infant baptism and put this other one into place. But we're still, as a football team, deciding how we operate as a football team. So it's kind of like a broad focus and a narrow focus, as I see it. The narrow focus is what does the work in apologetics, but it always assumes that broader focus, and that broader focus can be refined and can be made more precise.
Doesn't Dr. Van Til use an analogy of the military, the big guns, the apologist being the errand boy between systematic theology and other fields of study?
Yeah.
And all the point is, and see that we're defending the whole system we call Christianity. Again, not the blockhouse method, not just these 10 things, but it's the whole package that makes up our worldview.
Right.
Totally comprehensive.
Right. Now, is it destructive for us to admit to the unbeliever that because we are finite creatures of God, we admit that even as Christians, we are growing in our precision of understanding of what God has told us? In one sense, that's advantageous. Not because we have a cop-out later if there's something wrong in what we said. It's advantageous because we want to tell the unbeliever the only transcendental, the only final authority is God. And therefore, the fact that we don't have this infallibility of interpretation and we have to work on refining the details is just an indication that it's not our authority that we're standing on, but on God's. But we couldn't even refine our Christian theology if we didn't already know transcendentally that it was true. Van Til's image, and again, we use metaphors, how valuable is that? You decide. But I like this. I think it gets the point across. Van Til says, if you're trying to go across a swollen river where the bridge is under 8 inches of water, you got to get your car to the other side. Granted, as you go across that bridge, you're being real careful, aren't you? Because you can't see the surface of the bridge. There's 8 inches of water there. So you get to the other side. Well, take the situation, somebody says, well, since you can't see the surface of the bridge, you don't know exactly what the bridge looks like and where it is. You might as well ford the river anywhere. Well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Van Til says, granted, we don't see all the details. We're still working on textual criticism and things of that nature. But it makes all the difference in the world epistemologically that there's a bridge under us when we try to cross than that we are the man of water made of water with a ladder of water. Okay? You don't try to cross that bridge, don't try to cross that river without a bridge. So we've got a bridge, but we are finite and imperfect, and we're still working on seeing it more perfectly.
And, it's just, worldview. God's revelation.
It is not inconsistent in the Christian worldview that we are working on our theology progressively. That's right. That doesn't contradict. In fact, it fits into what we know about the nature of man. When will we know even as we are known, after all? Not in this life. Not until later. Okay, 5-minute break.
This recording
Hello, Base Theory. Can you hear me?
Hey, what's up, Jim Bob? You can just call me Grayson.
Oh, hey, Grayson, thanks. Okay, so let's just walk through this. I'm not talking about propositions because that's the thing in question. So you're saying propositions are events, and there's one event that can be proposition, and it happens to be proposition itself. I'm asking you, for every other event or object that you witness in the world, that you and I both witness in the world, objects, events, waterfall, everything out there in the external world that's just operating as event or objects, would you agree they're non-propositional?
Yeah. The only thing that I'm aware of that can be true or false are propositions.
Got it. So if every other event that you know of is non-propositional, that is to say, every event and object we know of in the world, every single one that we have access to today, can't be true or false. It's just not in the same category, right?
To my knowledge, yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. But you're saying there's only one that you know of, right? In reality.
Yeah.
All of reality. Okay. So the only event counter to every other event and object you know of, there's only one that you know of that has this feature of being true or false, and it's the proposition.
Yes, that's correct. Can I expound upon that a little bit, or do you want to continue?
Yeah, no, I'll let you, but I just want to ask you: do you see from that that even though inductive reasoning doesn't give us certainty, that you're making a very unlikely assertion that's not compatible with our particulars?
I don't, and I can explain why if you will allow me.
Okay, well, I just want to frame it when you because the only necessary thing that you have to provide here is what's physically different, because you're a physicalist in this argument, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So what's physically different about a proposition as an event that allows it to be propositional that the other events don't have? What's the property physically
pattern of molecular movement?
No, other events have specific patterns of molecular movement. I said, what's the thing that the proposition has? No. But that's not the answer, because what my question was is, what is it a proposition has as a physical property that makes it propositional that the other things don't have, that makes it distinct? And your answer actually isn't that answer, because those other events, waterfalls and car crashes, have what you just said.
No, they actually don't. They have other different patterns of movement that are not identical to the patterns of movement.
No, okay, fine.
Okay,
hold on. That's fine. But here's the thing. A waterfall doesn't have the exact pattern as a car crash. So that doesn't answer the question. What is it about? Just saying they're different doesn't tell me.
A waterfall's pattern of molecular movement is that of a waterfall. That's why it's different than a car crash. This is very obvious stuff, Jimbo.
No, a waterfall no, don't say it's obvious. A waterfall is non-propositional. It's an event. A car crash is non-propositional. It's an event.
Exactly.
The question isn't what's the difference between the organized events of molecules between a waterfall and a car crash. We already know that. I'm asking you, what is it about a proposition as an event, a physical event that's reduced to molecules, that's different about all of those other things that makes it propositional? I didn't ask whether it's different. I asked you what makes it propositional and truth apt.
Yeah, and my answer,
what is it physically?
Okay, Jim Bob, can I please just have a second to actually give an answer on this stuff? It feels like you haven't wanted me to give a real answer, so I'm just going to go ahead and
okay, I'll let you answer. I'll let you answer if you state back my question.
You don't want me to answer this.
No, I do. I want you to give me my question back. Can you give me my question back?
Okay, I can do that. Yes, I can do that.
Thank you.
You're asking what is it specifically? What physical property is it specifically about propositions that give them this special property of being able to be true or false that other things don't have? Because otherwise it's just special pleading unless I can expound what physical property they have that sets them apart. Is that you agree? That's your question, right?
Yeah, physically. Yep.
Okay, exactly. Yes. And the answer to that question is the specific patterns of molecular movement that go on in someone's brain when they are having a propositional thought. Now, let me expand upon that, okay? Because you're saying it's special pleading. You're saying only this thing can have true false, but nothing else can. But that's true of all, like something like things that are red. You're saying, oh, so you're saying that there's some little physical thing that everything that's not red in the universe has, but only the red things have it, and that's what makes them red. That's special pleading. It's not, because there's a specific.
No, it's not.
frequency
No, hold on. Let me stop you right there.
that has
No,
made
let
them
me stop.
red.
No, let me stop you right there. The red is disanalogous. Why? Because red is a result of something that's invariant called light frequency. So it can be isolated, even if it's on a spectrum. Still, it's on some. You can point to something as a referent called light frequency, and you could extrapolate of why something is red or how it's red or what things are red. It doesn't follow that just because something else isn't red that it's the same argument I'm making. Now, to your answer, just to repeat your answer, base theory, you said, I asked you what's specific about the proposition physically that's different from a waterfall and these other things that make it propositional. And you said it's the specific pattern of molecules, right?
The pattern of molecular movement. Yes.
Movement. Okay. So then the question is, what is it about that specific pattern of molecular movement that allows a proposition to be outside of the category of every other event? Because that doesn't tell me anything. That just says the movement is different. That doesn't tell me how it's propositional and the other things aren't.
Yeah. No, I hear you. So basically, the difference is that neural activity, the specific pattern of neural activity, can reference other things. So when I look at an apple, like a red apple, there's a specific pattern that occurs in my brain, and if that pattern is induced without the red apple, that will reference the red apple. I will have the thought of the red apple, or I will have an experience like a red apple. It will reference the red apple even without the red apple there. That's something that's unique to that specific pattern.
Hold on.
That is unique to that red apple pattern.
Okay, base theory. Your answer is now the difference is that it's capable of referencing things.
Yeah.
Okay. That doesn't answer it because you're just asserting the capability. I'm asking, what is it physically about a proposition that's based in physicality, unique as physicality, that allows it to reference things? I didn't say, what do you think a proposition is doing or an evaluation is doing, granting it its capability? The capability, I know the assertion of its capability. I'm asking, what is it specifically about the physicality that permits this capability? You're asserting it has the capability. That's what's different. No, that's the thing in question. I'm asking you from a physicalist view, you're going to have to tell me what's specifically different about the physicality that allows it to be a reference capability.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I could do it in one answer. In one word, rather. Sorry. The pattern.
The pattern. So my ability to reference an apple is exactly the molecular identical to yours.
It's not exactly molecularly identical, but it's going to be very similar. And in fact, there's going to be certain neurons in your brain that only activate when you're thinking about apples.
Okay, but still, you're still reasserting the capability without telling me how is it for particular kinds of molecular organized systems at that level permit. What makes it different than other molecular? Because everything else is composed and acting in a certain way from the molecular standpoint out there in the world, and you're just saying it looks different. There's a different look in organization of this pattern of molecular behavior in the brain, but that doesn't tell me how it suddenly can access and be outside of the category of every other event. It doesn't tell me how it is. It just tells me that it is. So you keep reasserting that it is.
So look,
I'm saying, how is that the case?
Yeah, okay, because it's a specific, unique pattern that no other pattern of molecular movement is doing. It's doing a specific pattern that correlates to something in the external world or internal world, like internal thoughts as well. But there's a correlation that you can see, you can test. Every time I put an apple in front of your face, you're going to have that specific neural correlate circuitry activity start activating every time. And then if you generate that exact pattern in your brain, you're going to start having references of apples across your conscious attention. Like, you can establish this as a cause and effect kind of thing.
I
It's
get it. Base theory.
Correlation.
I get you. I understand what you're asserting again, but it seems like you're not getting out of the cycle of reasserting what it's doing versus what is it about the specific organization of a pattern, by the way, which we all somehow share, but where they're different. So you're in a contradiction that the specific pattern you have of recognizing and making references isn't identical to mine. So now we have different patterns, right? That you're saying, well, no, it's the specific pattern that allows it to reference an apple. Yet you admitted my specific pattern is not the same as yours, and no one in the chat's specific pattern is molecularly exactly the same. And so all you're saying is that there's other people now have this pattern that's particular to their brain that allows that, but it doesn't answer the question, right? That the question again is,
Jimbo,
if you're
wait,
a physicalist,
hold on.
If you're a physicalist,
let me just I just need to clarify real quick that the patterns are a little course correcting, like the fine grained details kind of get washed out for the overall pattern. And I did specify in my previous answer that like your pattern of activity when you see or think about apples is going to be similar enough to mine to where like a sophisticated enough machine or an AI would be able to tell that we're both thinking about apples. Like, it'd be close enough to where a machine could generally just read people's thoughts. Like, that technology is like not 100 years away. You know what I mean?
Now, I understand what you're saying. But that's a different argument. The argument of whether or not you can connect to someone's brain and see different parts light up for certain references is irrelevant to the question. The question is, again, there's out there in the world, there's a bunch of molecules that act in a certain way that form shapes, let's say, and behaviors such that we can seek out particulars like a waterfall, a big waterfall, a small waterfall, an elephant. These things, you agree, are descriptively the same, right? That they're organized patterns of molecules, right? That they're behaving in a certain way, right? Such that they can be observed.
They're not descriptively the same. They're completely different patterns.
No, hold on. No, don't wait. Hold on. Don't go anywhere. No, hold on. Don't go on. The description is that they're molecules in motion. Let's say, just generally speaking.
They're all. But sure, you could generally describe them all as molecular movement. Sure.
I'm trying to establish a category. You can name it yourself. What's the category of all actions and events in your worldview? Molecules in motion, is that good enough?
Dude, if you want to just call everything molecular movement, fine. It's very general.
Perfect.
I get it. It's not specific at all.
Well, no, it's great to start general and then get more specific, right? It's a good method, right? I mean, it's inductive.
Are you waiting for my agreement?
Deductive, right? It's deductive. It's deductive because if we say, okay, from your worldview, everything's molecules in motion, great. So the question is, if everything's molecules in motion, what is specific about the physicality, not the capability, because that's reasserting the capability. I'm asking, what is it specifically about the physicality of what you call a proposition in the brain, which is a small segment of molecules in a particular kind of motion, that grants it the capability? I'm not asking you to reassert the capability. I'm asking you to identify what's specific about the organization of the molecules in the movement that makes it suddenly have the capability.
Right. No, and I feel like you should, at this point in the conversation, already know what my answer to that is. It's the specific
reasserting its capability.
Pattern. No, I'm not. It's the specific pattern of
that's the thing in question
in the brain. That's not not a capability.
No,
that's not begging the question.
No, it doesn't answer anything.
Specific pattern. Yes. You wait. Let me just get this sentence out. Let me just finish one sentence, Bob. One sentence. Okay, you would agree that there is a specific and unique pattern that occurs, like just with the apple example, right? Whenever the concept of apple is in my brain, there is a very specific and unique pattern in my brain. You agree with that, right? I
don't know what pattern you're pointing to. I know what you're saying is that there's there's a section of the brain that has something going on as hardware that is doing the work to make a reference to the apple itself. But your answer is this, based, as I said, what's different about that pattern over there? The waterfall is a specific pattern too. I'm asking you, what is the specific aspect of the physicality of the pattern? But you're just saying it's a specific pattern that allows for referencing. Well, that's the assertion of capability. I'm asking you, what is it about the pattern now? Because you're saying it's a specific pattern. Now I'm going to ask you, what is it about the specific pattern in the physical? Like, you have to reference its physicality, not its capability.
I got you. Sure. Okay. So just to clarify, because it feels like there's a little bit of ambiguity about what I mean by like a pattern of movement or whatever. Well, I want to clarify what I'm talking about, right? In the brain, in the neurons, whenever there's neural activity there, people describe it as like electricity often, but it's actually like the movement of salt ions, like back and forth, but like in and out of the neurons, as well as like neurotransmitter molecules. The movement of those molecules in a specific pattern of movement that corresponds with thinking about apples, the concept of apples. That's what I'm talking about, right? I want to be very specific that is what I'm referring to. Okay. So if we can be on the same page about that, then that'd be great. And we can move on from here.
Well, no, because that answer is asserting the capability, right? But that's the thing in question. You're saying,
well, I didn't assert any capability. I just said,
yeah, you did. It's
referencing.
That's
the pattern that we're talking about.
You're talking about reference. Is reference not an a capability? Can a waterfall? Wait. Hold on. Can a waterfall reference another waterfall?
No.
Is incapable, right? It's incapable.
Pretty much, yeah.
So, yeah, okay, great. So again, it's back to the external world as a whole. For everything we know about the external world, all of its patterns of all of its patterns and its behaviors of molecules at the molecular or macro is incapable of referencing other things. Now you're saying, I'm asking you, what's different about a proposition isolated as a little sliver of molecules as a pattern that make it capable of referencing? And you say, this pattern references an apple. Do you understand the problem here? You're just stating that it references.
Okay, so
I'm asking, how does molecules reference?
Yeah.
How?
Okay, yeah. I see. So, okay, there was a lot there to respond to, but basically, what you're talking about is like the overall, like, how do a bunch of molecules create like consciousness in general? Because I think like the specific neurons, like the patterns that correspond with the apple, right? They only have meaning because they're in our brains. They have to have the rest of the brain around them in order to have any kind of meaning. Like just that neural pattern alone isn't going to correspond with apple unless you have all of the rest of the circuitry to interpret it around it. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I mean, it's your statement. So you're including the brain as a machine, right? You need, for the pattern that you're using, a specific pattern of molecules that it's attached to this other mechanism called the brain. And you're saying the brain and the pattern itself are bonded together, right? All right. Now what you have, if we're reducing it to the initial category, is the brain and the pattern itself. The pattern is kind of indistinguishable of the brain. It's part of the brain. And so now you have this thing called the brain that is also organized.
Really quick. Let me just distinguish one thing. The pattern of molecular movement, that is like an activity that the brain is doing. It's not like identical to the brain. It's an activity the brain does.
Okay. Right. So like the water, the molecular structure of water is not identical to a waterfall falling. There's a behavior and then there's a molecular structure of what's behaving.
It's an activity.
Great. So again, the question would be, there's waterfalls that's made of molecular items, water, hydrogen, oxygen, but it's doing something. So that's a different thing than what it is, right? But if a proposition is an event, right, from your view, then what is a proposition made of and what is it doing?
Okay, so if we have an example of like a false proposition that we can talk about, right? Like if I say that apple is purple, right? That's an example of a proposition we could talk about. When I say that, or when you hear that, in your brain, basically, your brain is having the neural circuitry for apples and purples and connecting them together into basically a physical state of affairs, like a hypothetical state of affairs, basically, where there's a purple apple and it's showing like, if there was a purple apple, this is the brain state that would occur. I would look at the apple and it would be the purple brain state and the apple brain state at the same time. And then when I look at the apple,
stop there. Hold on. No,
red.
that's perfect.
Okay.
So if you isolated if you isolated an event of apple, right, that you're identifying as apple, a pattern, a molecular pattern that's doing a behavior, right? Could you take that physical thing and transport it into another brain, and that brain would interpret apple?
You could, but it wouldn't be exactly the same on a molecular level. But because of that fine, coarse grain correction that happens in our brain, you could effectively induce that brain, that like thought, into somebody else's, if you could manipulate it on that small molecular level, like precisely enough. Then yes, you could.
So if someone never saw an apple before, the entailment of your position is that you could extract a proposition as a physical collection of molecules in a certain pattern, and you could implant a proposition into someone's head as physical, and they would be able to interpret it, even if they've never seen an apple before.
It would be true for some things and not true for others. For example, like you need the fundamental groundwork. Like you can think of a purple apple even if you've never seen one, because you've seen an apple. You already have that groundwork in your brain. You already know purple. Okay. You can put them together in your imagination. We could induce a purple apple. But if there's something that you like have no groundwork for seeing because of like neuroplasticity, like maybe like if I forgot what example that you just used about transplanting in somebody's brain, but
just an apple
that I haven't seen before. Well, okay, if I've never seen an apple before, like maybe my circuitry that's associated with apples, if I have seen an apple, I can't transplant to your brain because you don't maybe even have the connections formed yet, because you don't have that past experience. So some things you could transfer, and some things are too distinct and too different, but some things are similar enough you could.
Could I remove
Sorry for that,
specific can I remove certain particular or universal concepts from the brain as physical things, and I just wouldn't have them?
Probably yes, because like for example, like those specific neurons in my brain that only activate when I'm thinking about apples. If you remove those, then like in some way my concept of apple will have been removed. Like I'll be missing some aspect of it.
Okay, so if something like propositions that are true or false, you're saying that if that's true, if it's true of an apple, then you could remove certain propositions like 2 + 2 = 4 and essentially remove the truth from someone's brain physically. A truth statement.
Yeah, they would have to like rediscover that 2 + 2 = 4. Like they would basically forget it. Yeah.
They would forget 2 +, but that would be then pointing to what a memory is versus what an evaluation of a memory is. So in your view, is a memory...
Just to clarify, both of those are physical. Both the memory and the evaluation of the memory are both physical activities.
Evaluation is a process, a physical process?
Yeah.
Okay. Is the physical process identical to the content of the process?
I'm pretty much on the fence about that. I don't really know how to answer that question, but for the sake of this argument, I can lean yes.
So then what's the distinction between the content and the physicality then? Because it seems like you need a process to process the content. In this case, there's activity in the brain, and the content of that activity is apples or mathematical statements or whatever else we want to input there. But if the process is identical to the content, then it seems to be that it's the distinction between a process and the content. I'm not sure what's the meaningful distinction between the process and the content then if it's identical.
So this is the reason why I'm on the fence about it, right? Why I hesitated, because to me, like the content is kind of like the subjective experience of these processes, which like our subjective experience of these physical processes, the activities in the brain, like at some to some degree they're identical, right? Like to some degree, like when I write a sentence on a piece of paper, it's identical with the ink on the page. But it also like there's the subjective experience of the sentence. There's also that kind of content, which
No, wait,
like
wait,
I
wait. Let me
hesitate
stop.
whether or not they're identical.
Wait a second. Did you just say if I write a sentence that the meaning of the sentence and the content is identical to the ink?
No. I'm not the
Oh, okay.
meaning of like basically the way I would think about the meaning of like if I see a sentence on a piece of paper where I think the meaning is occurring is like basically there is no meaning to that unless there's someone to interpret that sentence. There has to be a brain or a machine or something that is equipped properly to decode that meaning and get that meaning. And
Yeah.
so the meaning would exist like in the brain.
Yeah, that's why I asked you, Grayson, is because we make a distinction between the medium and the content. For instance, if I say apple, I'm perturbating air through the atmosphere, and it arrives as sound waves to people around me. But we would never say the air perturbation, the process itself, is identical to apple. It's something that's being used as a medium to then deliver transmission of something that means something that correlates with the sound. But the sound apple isn't identical to an apple the same way ink and a shape on the page is never identical to the symbol. Case in point, two different symbols in two different cultures written on paper would be perceived completely different. So that means like the medium is never identical to the content. That's why, from that perspective, if we know that about everything else we perceive, then that's why I asked you, do you think and it's fine if you hesitate, but that's why I asked you, is the content identical to the medium inside the brain? Because everywhere else we look, it's not. It's not the case that the content's identical to the medium.
So my connection is a little bad. You may have noticed a little bit of lag. You kind of dropped out in the middle of that, but I think I got the gist of everything that you were saying. No worries. Like one of the reasons why I would, like I said, I'm kind of on the fence. I just gave you one reason. I'll give you like the other reason, right? Because I think that they are so strongly linked, like the actual brain activity and then my own subjective experience of that activity are so strongly linked. Like I do think that subjective experience, consciousness itself, is a distinct pattern of brain activity that has to be generated by these neural circuits. But I'm saying like I think that the link is so strong that you could induce like a specific thought or idea in somebody's head, like we're saying, if you could precisely enough manipulate the molecules in their head, you could induce a thought. And so it just seems like there's such a strong link that they might actually just be identical, and the subjective experience of it is part of like the illusory aspect of that activity. I don't know.
Right, but you would agree that everything else, as far as medium and content in the external world that we look at and reference, they're not identical. But you're saying in the brain they might well be, and that's a fine if it's just kind of a hunch from your perspective, not holding you to it. The last question I'll have for you, I'll let you go, is if you make the statement that propositions are effects of physics in the brain, is there any way for you to demonstrate that that's true?
Yeah, sure. Like, similar to how we demonstrate like Brownian motion is the result of like specific atomic interactions by like breaking it down to like how one atom interacts with one other atom and then saying, okay, like when there's a bunch of atoms, it's really, really complicated. And that's what Brownian motion is caused by. When you look at when you break it down to just the single interactions, right? When you break it down to like when a proposition goes off in my head or a concept or whatever, you can tell, hey, there's a very specific neural circuit in my head that is going through that activity and moving a certain pattern of way. And then like when you mess with that, you could establish cause and effect by messing with it, having an experiment, an independent, dependent variable to manipulate it, see how that changes the concept, establish causality between the two things. You could, by like molecular neurobiology, establish these neural correlates.
Okay, so does that mean that based on all the methods that hypothetically you're saying could be the case, you're saying that you could put in a bunch of inputs in someone's brain and they'll spit out only true statements?
Hypothetically, sure. Before I go, we were kind of getting to the part where we talk about how these physical activities can be true or false, which is something that I often hear you say, and was kind of the whole point that I was hoping that we would get to in the conversation. So if we could,
Yeah,
we were talking about the proposition, right? The apple is purple.
I'm saying that the reason I brought you on is because I think it's special pleading still to say every other event and object we know of in the known universe is non-propositional. But there's only one event that you appeal to that is propositional. So it's the special one that doesn't follow the same categorical rules as everything else, every other event and object.
Well,
and when we go to the question again, isn't that what you're saying? That there's one only known.
No, I'm not. I feel like you're painting a little bit of a straw man there. Let me clarify, because, and this is why I did the example of red. It's like, I don't think it's special pleading, and I don't think you do either, to say that, oh, only things of this certain frequency are red, and everything else in the universe of all the other frequencies isn't red. Isn't that special? Like, that's
not special pleading. That's not special pleading. I already told you why. This is why it's no. Wait, let me clarify this. Why did I clarify that's disanalogous? Tell me why.
I don't know. Tell me again.
Because red has a referent called a frequency that's invariant and still has a scale in it, and it has a scale in the frequency, but redness itself is a universal we can point to. So it's not special pleading to say, look, these things that we call red, they associate to this other thing called a frequency in light that reflects things a certain way. What I'm saying is, isn't it the case from your view? Because the case in your view, is it not the case that you're saying the only known event or object, combination event object that you are saying exists that's propositional, that you know of, is a proposition itself? Everything else you know of
course, it's
is
word,
not, right? Well, no, but that's the thing.
Is everything red?
Okay, truth apt, let's say.
I'll explain to you why. We'll
say truth apt. Well, no, let's change the word. No, you have to answer the question base. I ask you a question. If you don't like the word proposition, fine, because that's definitional. Let's say truth apt. Say every event that happens, it's neither true or false. Every known event or object in the world that we know of, in the universe even, nothing we see in the external world as an event or an object itself is true or false. Propositions or evaluations, let's say evaluations, because evaluation itself, you don't need to state the proposition necessarily. An evaluation is an event, right, in space and time, a collection of objects. Yes. You're saying an evaluation, are you not saying that an evaluation is the only known event, object that you know of that ends up being truth apt or propositional? It's the only known one you know of. Is there any other known effects of physics?
To my knowledge, other than evaluations, no. So I would agree with that. Yeah, I think evaluations are special in that regard, but I don't think that's special pleading in the least.
It is special. It is special pleading because everything we know through all of our reasoning says events and objects aren't. No, red is not special, actually, because it's inside of a category of light on the light spectrum. So it's not special. It's not special because redness is in reference to. Wait. Hold on. Let me clarify this. I understand, but Base, you can't use redness anymore because I just established it's not special, because red is in reference to other colors we know, and they all have different descriptive aspects to them. So there's red and blue and all of the colors in the light spectrum we can point to, and we can understand how there's a light spectrum. We can manipulate it. We can talk about it. We can see what the gradient is in between the colors.
Okay, yeah, no, I got you. Can I respond?
So red's not special.
I got you. You're saying that red's not special because it's just one color in a spectrum, blah, blah, blah. But evaluations are just one activity in a spectrum of activities as well. Like you can just make the same. You can continue the analogy. These are just rhetorical games.
No, dude, no. It's not a rhetorical game. I just corrected you again, right? I'll correct you again why you just made a disanalogous jump. Red is inside of a spectrum something we can observe as a referent, right? It's in relation to other colors. We have a lot of colors we can refer to. So it's not special. Yes, they're unique, but they're still in reference to a system we can look at that maintains its invariance called the light spectrum frequency. It's invariant. We can point to it. We know its cause. We can manipulate it. The reason it's disanalogous to jump to, well, why can't there just be one special event in reality that's propositional? The reason is because red, our explanation of red, we use the same explanation to explain blue. That's not the same with events in the world and your jump to propositions, because our explanation of events in the world are that they're non-propositional. They're events. They're neither true or false. But there's this one that is.
No,
that's not the same as red.
Let me explain why not. Because basically the spectrum of activities of which evaluation is one subset is like different neural activities, and like not all neural activities are evaluations. There's other, and we use the same exact neurobiology, neurochemistry to explain all the rest of the neural activities as we do with evaluations. So it is analogous to red. And just because you're saying, well, red is reducible to one like frequency or whatever, one number we can quantify, like neural activity is reducible to like physical activities as well.
I know, but you're just granting yourself the capability of it, right? Still, the question is, how is an event inside of a brain that's an event of physical things in action? How is that event true or false? What is it about the event, its physicality? You can't just skip to its capability. You have to say, what is it about its physicality, its physical composition and behavior itself that makes it true or false, apt?
The pattern.
The pattern. That's just restating the claim again. We're going to go in a circle again. All right.
No,
well, if we're going to go in a circle, it's fine. Because you're just claiming the pattern and reinterpreting what the thing is I'm asking, the event, and you're just calling it a pattern and reasserting that the pattern is what makes it true or false.
But okay, you'd agree, right, that there are specific patterns of neural activity in the brain for different concepts like apple or purple. So if I have one in my brain for apple and purple, when I'm looking at a red apple, that is false. No, that's all physical.
No, that's just reasserting the capability of evaluation. That's the thing in question, dude. You're just giving yourself the evaluation of it.
But you don't
true,
even
false.
think that brains are capable of evaluating?
That's not what's in question. It's your view of physicalism. We're not talking. You're just
you said that I was
dude. That's a what about that, dude? I'm not holding.
Evaluation.
Do you understand that in an internal critique of physicalism, my view is irrelevant to whether I think or how I hold that brains are distinct machines that also are habitually tied to evaluation. Okay. It's irrelevant. I could just hold any view. It doesn't even matter. I could be a starseed right now, Grayson. It doesn't matter. The point is, when I ask you what's distinct about its physicality that makes it different from these other things that are not true or false and can't be true or false, you say it's the pattern. And I go, okay, then what's specific about the pattern itself? What's unique about a pattern of molecules that make it suddenly true or false? There are true patterns, you're saying. So you're true events. So you're saying there are true events.
There are events which reference states of affairs which can be true or false. So like
again,
the event itself can reference a true state of affairs or a false state of affairs.
So what event references that event, that next event though? Because what happens here, Grayson, is that to say that an evaluation is possible is to state that there's a difference between a referent and a reference, correct?
Sure.
A referent and a reference. If the reference process is itself a referent, then you have to now have a new evaluator evaluate the referent, the new referent. So there's no distinction in your view between, in regards to evaluations and propositions, there's no distinction between a referent and a reference. So if premise one, Grayson, is truth statement, or let's say knowledge itself, or acquisition of truth requires a distinction between referent and reference, But in under physicalism, there is no difference between a referent and a reference. Everything's just a referent, an object or event in space.
Yeah.
Then under physicalism, you don't have the preconditions for attaining knowledge or truth because everything's a referent. Everything's a referent. How is everything not a referent?
It depends because it depends on what's happening in the activity about what's being referenced and what's referring to.
Okay, Grayson,
anything can act as either one, but the distinct nature of what's actually going on in your system that you're trying to evaluate, you can see
is everything
what is
under
physical, what is being referenced.
I know you're asserting the capability again. I'm asking you a question. Is everything under a physicalist view ultimately a referent? An event, an object in space?
It can be if it's being referred
No,
to.
not can be. No, not can be. Is it a consequence, an entailment of physicalism? Is every single thing that happens as an event, including what you're calling references, evaluations, are they all themselves reference?
Only if they are being referenced.
No.
You're not a reference if you're not being referenced.
No, dude. Any reference is an activity of physicality in your brain. From your view, every activity that's including making a reference, right? I'm telling you that the new thing you're calling a reference, that's commenting or evaluating on the referent, the object, the event, the other event. I'm saying that new event is now a referent. Is it not?
So what?
So
yeah,
what?
Sure.
So there's no distinction.
I could be a referent, and yet I can still reference things.
No, that's granting yourself capability. I'm saying from your view, there's no distinction between a referent and a reference.
I'm not granting myself anything.
You are.
We all agree I can reference things. I'm not granting
agreeing we can reference things is not the argument, because the argument is whether or not we agree. The argument is an internal critique of the entailments of physicalism. So just bear with me. Under physicalism, is there no real distinction between a referent and a reference?
It depends on the actual nature of the activity. Like if you're saying like
the nature of an activity is an event.
Look, let me describe it. You're saying that
Grayson,
anybody can throw a ball, anybody can catch a ball. But if I point to two people throwing and catching, I can point he's the catcher, he's the thrower.
Grayson, is an activity
like you,
a referent?
Bob, you look like a catcher.
Grayson, is an activity a referent?
It can be. You can reference it.
So, is that new reference of that referent another referent?
Sure.
So everything's just a referent. That's my point.
The
There's no distinction. You have no distinction.
Yeah, like I said, it can be.
No, the issue is, in order to have knowledge or truth acquisition, you need to have referent and reference. If there's no distinction between referent...
Okay, wait. I see our difference. I see our distinction here. Like I'm saying that something can be a referent in one situation and it can reference other things in other situations. It's situational.
Right. So
I know you're saying
so now
the
you're saying
referent cannot be the reference, but I'm saying in one situation it can be the reference, in one it can be the reference.
Under physicalism, is there any situation or event that's not a referent?
Any of them can be at any time.
No, all of them necessarily have to be because they're activities and events in the world. They can be. They have to be. No, a referent.
Then how are they a referent?
So a referent. So do you make a referent?
Breakdown in terminology that I'm not understanding here, but if it's not being referenced currently, then why would it be a referent?
Well, that pretty much ends the possibility of evaluation. If you just admitted, my premise one is that for even to have the concept of a referent and a distinction of a referent, you need a mind to do the referencing. Now, if the mind is itself a referent, you don't have a reference, because
why not?
Because you have no because the mind itself ends up being a referent. So that's the end of the physicalist position.
Why?
You just ended it yourself.
Can be a reference, and it can also reference things. But wait, I'm asking you why. My mind right now can be a reference, and it can reference things.
It's the activity of its referencing things is identical to your mind under your view. It's the same exact object and event in space. You're granting yourself this other thing
Sure,
called
yeah.
a reference that's not identical to your mind. I just said there's no distinction under your view between a referent and a reference. Yet here you are saying, I can have knowledge because I can reference things. And I just said, no, under your view, those things are the same thing. There's no distinction of a reference in your view. There's just a new referent, an activity in space that you now need another mind that's not the referent to look at and evaluate.
Can you?
It's the end of the position.
Jim Bob, in plain English, can you just explain to me why the when I look at the apple and I have the pattern of neural activity for the apple, why is it that pattern of neural activity for apple is not referencing an apple?
What? If you
'Cause
see
to
a
my view,
pattern
it
of an
definitely
apple,
is referencing the apple.
the question isn't the method. The
No, no,
question
no.
is the You're
No, I'm
asking me a question,
if I
right?
see
You're
an
asking me a
apple,
question.
right? I'm asking. Yes, I am. Yes, I'm asking.
You're saying
if I see an apple and I have
Mhm.
the distinct pattern of neural activity that happens in my head whenever I see that apple, if that is later on induced into my head, is that not a reference to the apple? Is that like that neural activity
That's
that happens in my head? Is that not referencing the apple?
that thing is a referent. That thing you're
But
calling
it is also
referencing.
referencing the apple.
Well, no, the thing that's a referent now needs a new reference of that referent. So, do you understand? Like, if you import an action or a set of molecules or objects and a behavior into a brain, right? That
Yep.
thing is now a referent. But what you're saying is, no, that thing's a reference. That's inducing a reference. Well,
Yes,
I'm
it
saying
is.
whatever it induces under the physicalist view is now a new referent that needs to be referenced. Do you understand? Like you're just ending the process with, no, I have a reference now for the referent. And I'm saying, no, under a physicalist view, the referent, the thing you're calling a reference, that thing is actually a referent under a physicalist view. It's a new epiphenomenal physical phenomenon that happened in the brain as physical matter. And so now you need another evaluator to then determine whether your reference itself is.
Well, why can't it be both? Why can't it be both? Because
if it's both,
like,
then you hold on.
whenever
If it's
I have-
both,
What-
if it's both, then there's no distinction between referent and reference. How could A equal A and not A? It's a violation of the law of identity.
because like if you induced like if you like saved the neural activity in my head from before when I was seeing the apple and you induced it in my head later, that is referencing the apple. I don't understand how any rational sane person can argue otherwise.
Yeah, that's granting
Like, in
yourself
my head-
yeah, I know. You're granting yourself
In
the
my head,
conclusion.
You've referenced
You're-
the apple.
You're granting yourself the conclusion. Are there some people who see an apple and they actually reference a coffee mug? Are there some people?
So you're saying it was like a mistake and like I accidentally referenced it, but you're saying a reference still occurred in the brain, a reference to coffee mug. So you're still saying that the physical brain activity can reference things. This time, it's just the incorrect thing.
I'm saying that if you hold a position where there's no distinction between a referent and a reference, you don't have the methodology to make evaluations because the evaluation itself is a new object, event, phenomenon in space and time as matter that then needs to be referenced again. You got to reference it again now.
But I just gave you
Now,
I just gave you a distinct example that so
With
far
a
I have
conclusion.
not heard you refute. For the
I did
actual
refute it.
activity, The activity
Yeah, you came
of
to a
pattern in my brain. The activity of wait. The activity of pattern in my brain that corresponds to apple is both a reference to apples and a new referent itself. It's both. They're not mutually exclusive.
That's great. So the new reference that you're calling a referent also called that's an apple. Is that correct? A conclusion about
The actual pattern of molecular movement in my brain.
Right. Yeah. The pattern of
That
molecular
corresponds to the
movement in your
concept of apple.
brain is a conclusion, right? That's an apple.
It doesn't
Right.
have to be a conclusion. It just represents the concept of apple.
Okay. There's an activity in the brain that induces a reference to something external called an apple, right? And that happened as an event, right?
Wait. The activity is the reference. Yes.
Yeah, the activity is a reference. Okay, so there's something that triggered a neurological phenomenon that you're calling a reference that's referring to this concept of an apple in the external world. That's what's happening. That's a new event now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if that's a new event, what's the thing that's referencing that as a new event?
What's the thing that's referencing that as a new event? Like me right now referencing it. What do you mean?
No, you, this is exactly where I wanted you. You yourself, now you've granted yourself another evaluator that's independent of the event. That case closed. That's all I needed from you.
So what?
So what?
Why is that
Yeah,
a
so
big deal? I
what?
haven't
If
did
you
it.
say so what, that's fine. If you say so what, I invite you. I'm not going to go back into it. I invite you to re-listen to this, and especially at this end part, because I distinguish for you that there's an event in space and time that called an apple, and then you, from your view, there's a neurological phenomenon that references that apple as an apple, and that itself is an event. And I asked you, okay, you had a phenomenal event in the brain. I asked you, well, now what's referencing that event? And you said me, as if you are distinct than from a referent or another event. Think about that. I mean, I can't take you any further down this line.